Generous giving. We are to give material gifts thankfully, joyfully, and consistently to help carry out the Great Commission. Here now is Dr. Gene Getz.
When you read this principle, I'm sure a question might go through your mind, particularly when you read the psalm, is how in the world does that principle come out of this psalm? Where do you get that principle? Well, again, like in so many psalms, we have to understand the background. We have to understand the special occasions that gave rise to this kind of poetry in David's life, particularly as he wrote this psalm. And it really relates to the first fruits that the children of Israel were supposed to give under the law that God had established. Now, there were several feasts and festivals where the people of Israel gave their first fruits. This one may have referred to the Feast of Tabernacles. But with this in mind, as you look at those feasts and what they were to do with their first fruits, you begin to see something emerge here you don't see otherwise. Look at verse 1 of Psalm 65. Praise is rightfully yours, God, in Zion. Vows to you will be fulfilled. And when you see the term vows to you will be fulfilled, that is often used in relationship to first fruits, to tithing, to giving of their possessions. And as you move on in this psalm, you see specifics. For example, abundant crops. Verse 9. The prayer says, you visit the earth and water it abundantly, enriching it greatly. God's stream is filled with water, for you prepare the earth in this way, providing what? People with grain. And they gave grain offerings. And so they're talking here about first fruits. In Psalm 65:13, you have reference to sheep and goats. The pastures are clothed with flocks, and the valleys covered with grain. They shout in triumph. Indeed, they sing. And so, in essence, what David is talking about is that these are gifts from God to be given back to God in proportion to the way God is blessing. And of course, this was a command that was given in the law of Moses. An illustration comes from the book of Nehemiah. And when Nehemiah went back to Jerusalem to help rebuild the walls with the help of King Artaxerxes, it was a miracle how he was able to go back and to rebuild those walls in an incredible 52 days and then to restore worship. And when you look at Nehemiah chapter 10, you see a reference to the first fruits and to these offerings. And notice what we read in verse 35. We will bring the first fruits of our land. That's the grain. We will bring the first fruits of our land and of every fruit tree to the Lord's house year by year. We will also bring the firstborn of our sons and our livestock as prescribed by the law. Notice it says, as prescribed by the law. And we'll bring the firstborn of our herds and flocks to the house of our God, to the priests who serve in our God's house. And I believe that this psalm here, as you read through it, and many expositors really believe that David is here referring to these first fruits that we should give to the Lord. And in this case, Israel is an example of this. And it continued. And I love what we read in Luke chapter 2. And here in Luke chapter 2, you have a unique reference to this whole concept in relationship to Jesus and his birth, and to Mary and to Joseph. And notice in verse 22 of Luke chapter 2, it says, and when the days of their purification according to the law of Moses were finished, did you get that? The law of Moses. They brought him, Jesus, up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. Now notice, Luke says, just as it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male will be dedicated to the Lord. And here in Nehemiah, that is what it's referring to in terms of the firstborn, the male firstborn, presented to the Lord. And then it says, and to offer a sacrifice according to what is stated in the law of the Lord, in this case, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. And if you go back to the law, it made provision for poor people. And if they couldn't bring a lamb or they couldn't bring a goat or sheep because they were too poor, they could bring a turtle dove, 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. And we see here Mary and Joseph giving of these first fruits and these offerings to the Lord. Now, it's really interesting how paganism perverted this concept of bringing every firstborn male as an offering. And Jesus is referring to this, I believe, or Luke is referring to this in the life of Jesus in terms of the fact that he was presented to the Lord according to the law of Moses. Paganism, literally, there were child sacrifices, a perversion of this concept in a horrible, terrible way. And so consequently, we have here an illustration of presenting the firstborn. And I think there's a principle there in relationship to our families. And I'll never forget the fact that my own mother, in her naivete, in her lack of teaching, back on the farm in Indiana, and she told me this story, and I've never gotten away from this, that she was listening to a message on an old battery-operated radio back in when I was born in 1932. And she was listening to Dr. Ironside, who was pastor of the Moody Church, and he was dedicating children to the Lord. And she never heard of such a thing. And she told me, when I was old enough to understand, that that day she knelt there in that old kitchen with me in her arms, dedicating me to the Lord. And as I was reflecting on that in terms of this passage, I'm thankful for that. And I can't be prophetic about what God did, but I certainly can't get away from the fact that may have impacted my life in a very unique way. But I'm thankful for that. And I think that there's a great principle that comes out of this in terms of our families presenting our children to the Lord, not just the firstborn, but of all of our children as gifts to God. Now, in terms of the first fruits, as far as grain and as far as animals are concerned, we know that cultures vary. The primitive cultures, when they practice this, like Israel, they did not have a currency system like we do. And you can go to certain cultures today, and they give eggs and chickens and pigs and those elements, along with grain and bread and those things, as an offering to be able to fulfill the first fruit offerings which were to be given to support particularly those in the ministry. And so this is a principle that applies anywhere in the world regarding of the way we negotiate, whether it's material objects or whether it's currency. And of course, we understand currency in a very, very unique way. And 2 Corinthians is a wonderful chapter I recommend to anybody to read in relationship to the way in which we are to give thankfully and joyfully and consistently. And so this is the principle I see emerging from this psalm. Let me just repeat that principle. We're to give material gifts thankfully, joyfully, and consistently to help carry out the Great Commission. But here's the thing I'd like for you to underscore in your mind. If you go back to 2 Corinthians and you read that chapter 9 particularly, you come to verse 15. And this is what we read. This is our motivation for generosity. And Paul caps it with these words: Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. In other words, Jesus Christ gave us the gift of eternal life, and that should be our motivation for giving. The motivation in the Old Testament was the law. It was legislated. God doesn't legislate in the New Testament. He asks us to give generously because of his grace. And to me, that's a powerful motivation. But here's the question for reflection response in relationship to what happened in the Old Testament. Since the children of Israel, who are living under law, were to give a tithe, 10%, of their material resources to support the priests and Levites in Israel, and let me just simply comment at that point, is that the first tithe, or 10%, was to be given to support the priests and the Levites who ministered to the people of Israel in terms of their worship activities. They actually had 3 tithes. They had a second tithe that they set aside to make a trip to Jerusalem to worship. They had a third tithe they gave every third year for widows and orphans. It was a self-contained culture and society. They didn't pay taxes at that point to kings and so forth, except there were certain situations that evolved where they had to do that. But even when they were paying taxes to Artaxerxes or the Persian kings, they still were practicing these tithes. But in the most part, when it first instituted, it was a self-contained culture and society. But here's the rest of the question. If that were true in Israel, just the 10% to support those who serve, how much should we as Christians who live under grace give to support those who faithfully minister in our local churches and in various mission activities? And to me, the answer to that question is, if the children of Israel gave 10% under law, how much should we be giving under grace? And that's something to think about. And I think that every Christian ought to have a goal, at least, of giving at least 10% under grace. If they can't make it at this moment, they should have a goal to see what God will do when they start giving regularly and faithfully. And many of you have heard me share the story that I'm so thankful for my wife. And when we got married, I grew up on a little farm in Indiana, and my parents had no concept of tithing and giving. She grew up in a little farm in Minnesota, but I've heard her say, I saw my parents, even with their meager income, writing out those checks for missionaries and for the church. And that impacted her little heart. And we got married, and I brought home my first full-time paycheck, and you'd be amazed at what it was. Of course, that was in the 50s. But she said, we've got to write out 10% on what you're bringing, not just what we're bringing home, but, before taxes. And I said, you can't do that. We can't make it. And she said, I think we can. And so from that point forward, even though we had very little, we built from that. It was just built in to our giving. And I'm so thankful for that, because that was the goal that we shot for. We're able to make throughout our lives, simply because we built everything around that. God honored that, and then we were able to, at times, go beyond that in terms of grace giving. But I think if every Christian took that seriously, it would change their lives, and it would change the life of the church and missions. And I'm so thankful for that, because if she hadn't done that, I'm not sure I would have become a regular giver. I'm not sure when that would have happened. So let's remember this principle to live by. We're to give material gifts thankfully, joyfully, consistently to help carry out the Great Commission.